the affluent shores of Long Island, New York, sits a Georgian colonial mansion that once housed the most dangerous scientific movement in American history. Between 1910 and 1939, this unassuming building at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory became ground zero for a pseudoscientific campaign that would sterilize over 60,000 Americans, inspire Nazi Germany's racial laws, and fuel one of humanity's darkest chapters. What began as legitimate genetic research transformed into a systematic plan to eliminate undesirable populations through forced sterilization and immigration restrictions. The scientists working within these walls didn't just conduct experiments, they architected policies that would devastate millions of lives worldwide. This is the shocking true story of how America's most controversial science mansion became the epicenter of the global eugenics movement. The year was 1904, and Charles Benedict Davenport stood on the pristine shoreline of Cold Spring Harbor, New York, watching construction crews break ground on what would become one of America's most prestigious scientific institutions. At 38 years old, Davenport was already recognized as a brilliant Harvard-educated biologist, but his vision extended far beyond traditional research. He dreamed of applying the newly rediscovered laws of Mendelian genetics to solve what he perceived as America's greatest social problems. The location was perfect for his ambitious plans. Cold Spring Harbor sat just 30 miles from New York City, close enough to attract the nation's intellectual elite, yet isolated enough to conduct sensitive research away from public scrutiny. The Carnegie Institution of Washington had agreed to fund Davenport's station for experimental evolution, providing him with an annual budget of $35,000, a fortune in 1904 dollars, to pursue cutting-edge genetics research. Davenport's early work focused on legitimate scientific questions about heredity in plants and animals. His experiments with mice, canaries, and chickens produced respected publications in the field of experimental biology. But beneath this scholarly exterior, Davenport harbored beliefs that would prove catastrophically dangerous. He was convinced that human traits like intelligence, criminality, and even moral character were as heritable as eye color or height. The intellectual foundation for his thinking came from Francis Galton, Charles Darwin's cousin who had coined the term eugenics in 1883. Galton's concept was seductively simple. If farmers could selectively breed superior livestock, why couldn't society improve the human race through similar methods? The idea appealed to America's progressive-era reformers, who believed that scientific methods could solve all social problems. What made Davenport's approach particularly dangerous was his ability to cloak racial prejudice in the language of legitimate science. Unlike crude bigots who relied on emotion and tradition, Davenport presented himself as an objective researcher seeking empirical truth. He published papers in respected journals, spoke at academic conferences, and maintained correspondence with leading scientists worldwide. The transformation of Cold Spring Harbor from legitimate research center to eugenics headquarters began in 1907, when Davenport shifted his focus from animal genetics to human heredity. His first human studies examined relatively straightforward physical traits like hair and eye color, which could indeed be traced through family lineages using Mendelian principles. But Davenport quickly expanded his research to encompass complex behavioral and psychological characteristics. The scientific methodology was fundamentally flawed from the beginning. Davenport's researchers relied on subjective observations, family interviews, and institutional records rather than controlled experiments. They attempted to trace traits like feeble-mindedness, criminality, and pauperism through family trees, despite having no reliable methods for measuring these characteristics. Even more problematically, they made no attempt to separate genetic factors from environmental influences like poverty, education, or social discrimination. By 1910, Davenport had attracted the attention of Mary Williamson Averill Harriman, widow of railroad magnate E.H. Harriman. Mrs. Harriman was deeply concerned about what she perceived as America's moral decline, evidenced by rising immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, increasing urbanization, and changing social norms. When Davenport proposed establishing a specialized research office to study human heredity, she eagerly provided the necessary funding. The Eugenics Record Office officially opened its doors on October 1, 1910, in a modest Victorian house on the Cold Spring Harbor campus. To lead this new institution, Davenport recruited Harry Hamilton Laughlin, A former Iowa school superintendent whose background in animal breeding had caught Davenport's attention, Laughlin was younger and more zealous than his mentor, with an unshakable belief that eugenics could remake American society. From the outside, the ERO appeared to be conducting legitimate scientific research. Field workers trained at Cold Spring Harbor fanned out across the country, collecting family histories from hospitals, prisons, and institutions for the mentally disabled. They documented physical characteristics, medical conditions, and behavioral patterns, creating detailed pedigree charts that supposedly revealed hereditary patterns. But the true agenda was far more sinister. Davenport and Laughlin weren't simply studying human genetics. They were building a database to support predetermined conclusions about racial and social hierarchy. Their research consistently proved that immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe carried defective genes, that poverty and criminality were hereditary conditions, and that certain racial groups were inherently inferior to others. The scientific community initially embraced the ERO's work with enthusiasm. Respected geneticists like Thomas Hunt Morgan and Herbert Spencer Jennings served on advisory committees, lending credibility to the organization's research. Major philanthropic foundations, including the Rockefeller Foundation, provided additional funding. By May 1915, the ERO had become the undisputed center of American eugenics research, with international recognition and influence. What none of these distinguished supporters realized was that they were enabling the construction of a scientific foundation for systematic human rights violations. The data being collected at Cold Spring Harbor would soon be used to justify forced sterilizations, immigration restrictions, and ultimately, genocide on an unprecedented scale. Hey everyone, if this incredible true story is capturing your attention, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our deep dive historical documentaries. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from our global community of history enthusiasts. Harry Hamilton Laughlin stepped off the train at Cold Spring Harbor Station on a crisp October morning in 1910, carrying 2 suitcases and an unshakable conviction that he was about to change the course of human evolution. At 30 years old, Laughlin possessed an unusual combination of agricultural expertise and zealous social activism that made him the perfect lieutenant for Charles Davenport's eugenic crusade. Laughlin's background was distinctly American. Born in rural Iowa, educated at a teacher's college, and experienced in the practical science of animal breeding. Unlike Davenport, who came from Harvard's ivory towers, Laughlin understood how to translate theoretical genetics into concrete policy recommendations. His expertise with livestock breeding had convinced him that the same principles could improve the human species, if only society had the courage to implement them systematically. Within months of his arrival at Cold Spring Harbor, Laughlin had transformed the ERO from a modest research office into a bustling center of eugenic activism. He recruited and trained dozens of field workers, mostly young women with backgrounds in social work or teaching, who would serve as the movement's data collectors. These workers received intensive instruction in recognizing hereditary defects and documenting family histories that supported eugenic theories. The fieldwork methodology was deeply problematic from a scientific standpoint, but brilliantly effective as propaganda. Workers visited psychiatric hospitals, poorhouses, prisons, and immigrant communities, armed with questionnaires designed to confirm predetermined conclusions about hereditary deficiency. They recorded not just medical conditions and physical traits, but subjective assessments of character, intelligence, and social worthiness. A typical ERO investigation might begin with a single, defective individual, perhaps someone committed to a mental institution or convicted of a crime. Field workers would then trace this person's family tree, seeking evidence that undesirable traits ran in the bloodline. When they found relatives who were poor, unemployed, or in trouble with the law, this was recorded as proof of hereditary taint. Environmental factors like discrimination, lack of education, or economic hardship were ignored entirely. By 1914, Laughlin had collected over 500,000 individual records, creating what he claimed was the world's most comprehensive database of human heredity. In reality, it was a massive collection of prejudiced observations and circular reasoning, designed to support predetermined conclusions about racial and social hierarchy. But to contemporaries, the sheer volume of data appeared impressively scientific. Laughlin's true genius lay in his ability to translate this flawed research into concrete policy recommendations. Unlike academic researchers content to publish papers and attend conferences, Laughlin actively lobbied state legislatures, testified before congressional committees, and drafted model legislation for eugenic reforms. He understood the data without political action was meaningless. The goal wasn't just to study human heredity, but to control it. His first major policy triumph came in 1922 with the publication of Eugenical Sterilization in the United States, a comprehensive study that included his Model Eugenical Sterilization Law. The document identified 10 categories of people who should be forcibly sterilized: the feeble-minded, insane, criminalistic, epileptic, inebriate, diseased, blind, deaf, deformed, and dependent. These classifications were so broad and subjective that they could potentially encompass millions of Americans. What made Laughlin's sterilization law particularly dangerous was its veneer of legal respectability. Unlike earlier eugenic proposals that relied on crude racial categories, Laughlin's law used medical and psychological terminology that seemed scientifically objective. It included procedural safeguards and appeals processes that gave the appearance of due process, while in practice making sterilization almost inevitable for anyone brought before a eugenic tribunal. The law's impact was immediate and devastating. By 1924, 15 states had adopted variations of Laughlin's model legislation, with Virginia's version becoming the template for the most notorious case in American eugenic history. When 18-year-old Carrie Buck was selected for sterilization under Virginia's new law, Laughlin provided crucial testimony supporting the procedure despite never having met Buck or examined her family history personally. Laughlin's deposition in the Buck case revealed the depth of his prejudice and the shoddiness of his scientific methods. He described Buck's family as the shiftless, ignorant, and worthless class of antisocial whites of the South, based entirely on second-hand reports and his own social biases. When the case reached the Supreme Court in 1927, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes cited Laughlin's research in his infamous opinion upholding compulsory sterilization. But Laughlin's influence extended far beyond American borders. His correspondence files reveal extensive communication with eugenic researchers in Germany, including several who would later become architects of Nazi racial policy. German eugenicists praised Laughlin's work as pioneering research in racial hygiene and explicitly cited his model sterilization law as the basis for their own legislation. In 1936, the University of Heidelberg awarded Laughlin an honorary doctorate, praising his contributions to the science of racial cleansing. The ceremony took place just 3 years after Germany had implemented sterilization laws based directly on Laughlin's model, resulting in the forced sterilization of over 350,000 people. By the mid-1930s, even Laughlin's supporters at the Carnegie Institution had grown uncomfortable with his increasingly radical positions and shoddy scientific methods. His correspondence with Nazi researchers and his public support for German racial policies had become an embarrassment to the institution. Yet Laughlin remained convinced that he was a pioneering scientist, working to improve humanity through rational scientific methods. The morning of June 15, 1912, marked the opening of the first International Eugenics Congress at the University of London, where over 750 delegates from around the world gathered to share research and coordinate policies for improving the human race. Among the attendees were some of the most respected scientists, politicians, and social reformers of the era, including Charles Davenport and Harry Laughlin from Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. What distinguished this Congress from other scientific meetings was its explicit focus on translating research into social policy. Presentations covered topics like the elimination of the unfit and the sterilization of defectives, delivered with the same academic rigor typically reserved for discussions of plant genetics or chemistry. The Cold Spring Harbor delegation presented their data collection methods as a model for other nations to emulate. Back at Cold Spring Harbor, the ERO had developed an increasingly sophisticated apparatus for documenting and categorizing human beings. The main building housed a vast filing system containing over 750,000 index cards by 1924. each representing an individual American whose genetic value had been assessed by ERO field workers. The cards were color-coded, white for normal individuals, yellow for those with minor defects, and red for those deemed severely defective. The ERO's record office resembled a macabre library, with floor-to-ceiling filing cabinets containing detailed family histories stretching back generations. Field workers had documented everything from physical disabilities and mental illness to personality traits, like shiftlessness and love of the sea. These subjective assessments were treated as objective genetic data, forming the basis for sweeping conclusions about human heredity. Laughlin had developed standardized forms for recording defective traits, with categories that revealed the deep prejudices underlying eugenic research. Forms included spaces for documenting wanderlust, nomadism, and inability to hold a grudge, characteristics that seemed suspiciously aligned with stereotypes about immigrant populations and racial minorities. Field workers were instructed to look for evidence of inherited criminality in families where anyone had been arrested, regardless of whether the charges were related to actual criminal behavior or simply violations of discriminatory laws. The methodology for collecting this data was fundamentally flawed from any legitimate scientific perspective. Field workers often relied on gossip, institutional records, and their own subjective impressions rather than medical examinations or standardized psychological tests. They frequently visited poor and immigrant communities specifically looking for evidence of genetic deficiency, while ignoring similar problems in middle-class and upper-class families. One particularly disturbing aspect of the ERO's work was its focus on entertainment performers and circus workers. Field workers collected detailed pedigrees from circuses and freak shows, documenting unusual physical characteristics and creating elaborate charts showing how abnormalities were inherited. While this research was presented as scientific investigation, it often involved exploiting vulnerable performers who had little choice but to cooperate with researchers if they wanted to continue earning a living. The ERO also maintained extensive correspondence with institutions across the country, gathering records from hospitals, prisons, and schools for the disabled. Administrators eagerly cooperated, viewing the research as scientifically valuable and potentially beneficial for their institutions. They had no way of knowing that their patient records would be used to justify systematic violations of human rights. Perhaps most chillingly, the ERO developed detailed plans for expanding eugenic control beyond sterilization. Internal documents discussed the possibility of lethal chambers for individuals deemed severely defective, forced relocation of dysgenic populations, and comprehensive breeding programs to optimize the genetic composition of future generations. While these extreme proposals were never officially published, they reveal the ultimate logic of eugenic thinking. The international reach of the ERO's influence became apparent through its extensive publication program. Eugenical News, the ERO's quarterly newsletter, was distributed to researchers, policymakers, and eugenic societies in dozens of countries. The publication featured articles praising sterilization laws, promoting immigration restrictions, and documenting supposedly scientific evidence for racial hierarchy. By 1925, the newsletter had subscribers on every continent, making it a primary vehicle for spreading American eugenic ideas worldwide. Foreign researchers regularly visited Cold Spring Harbor to learn ERO methods, with delegates from Germany being particularly frequent guests. These visits involved detailed training in family pedigree analysis, statistical methods for proving genetic causation, and strategies for building political support for eugenic policies. The visiting researchers returned to their home countries armed with American methodologies and convinced of the scientific validity of eugenic theories. The ERO also maintained a lending library of eugenic literature, which by 1930 contained over 15,000 books, pamphlets, and research papers from around the world. This collection included early Nazi publications on racial hygiene, which ERO staff reviewed favorably and recommended to American researchers. The library served as a clearinghouse for international eugenic thinking, facilitating the exchange of ideas that would prove catastrophic for human rights. What made the ERO's work particularly dangerous was its veneer of scientific respectability. Unlike crude racist propaganda, the research produced at Cold Spring Harbor appeared in academic journals, was cited by respected scholars, and influenced government policy through apparently objective data analysis. This scientific legitimacy made eugenic arguments much more persuasive to educated Americans who would have rejected obvious bigotry. Before we continue with this shocking historical account, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories that reveal the hidden chapters of American history. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love connecting with our international audience. On March 20th, 1924, Virginia Governor E. Lee Trinkle signed into law the most consequential piece of eugenic legislation in American history. The Virginia Sterilization Act was based directly on Harry Laughlin's Model Eugenical Sterilization Law, with little modification, 2 years after it was published. What made this law different from earlier eugenic legislation was its careful legal construction and its selection of a test case that would establish a permanent, constitutional precedent for forced sterilization. The path to this moment had begun 2 years earlier in Laughlin's laboratory at Cold Spring Harbor, where he meticulously crafted legislation designed to withstand constitutional challenges. His model sterilization law stressed the need for the sterilization of populations that Laughlin deemed inadequate, for reasons ranging from physical appearance to socioeconomic status. The categories included not just the mentally disabled and criminals, but also the dependent, a classification so broad it could encompass anyone who had ever received public assistance. By 1914, 12 states had already passed sterilization laws, beginning with Indiana in 1907 and Connecticut in 1909. However, the laws were not employed with significant vigor, with the exception of California. Laughlin quickly realized that these early laws contained fatal flaws that made them vulnerable to constitutional challenges and difficult for administrators to implement effectively. The genius of Laughlin's model law lay in its procedural safeguards, which created an appearance of due process while making sterilization virtually inevitable. The law required medical examinations, legal hearings, and appeals processes, but these were conducted by officials who were already convinced of eugenic principles. The burden of proof was placed on victims to demonstrate their genetic fitness, rather than requiring authorities to prove unfitness. The selection of Carrie Buck as Virginia's first test case was no accident. Albert Priddy, the superintendent of the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded, requested the authority to sterilize an 18-year-old patient, Carrie Buck. Buck had been committed to the institution after becoming pregnant out of wedlock, a circumstance that her foster family found socially embarrassing. Her case was deliberately chosen because it would allow eugenic advocates to argue that feeble-mindedness was being passed through 3 generations of the same family. Laughlin, who had never met Buck, gave a deposition endorsing her suitability for sterilization, calling the family members of Buck the shiftless, ignorant, and worthless class of anti-social whites of the South. His testimony was based entirely on second-hand reports and institutional records, yet it was presented as expert scientific opinion. The trial was essentially a charade, with Buck's appointed attorney providing minimal defense and actually supporting the sterilization order. When Buck v. Bell reached the Supreme Court in 1927, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes delivered one of the most chilling opinions in American legal history. Writing for an 8-1 majority, Holmes declared that 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, and upheld Virginia's sterilization law as a legitimate exercise of state police power. The decision explicitly compared compulsory sterilization to compulsory vaccination, arguing that society had the right to prevent the reproduction of citizens it deemed genetically defective. 5 months after the court confirmed the law, Carrie Buck was sterilized. Tragically, later investigations revealed that Buck was not intellectually disabled at all. She had been institutionalized because of the social stigma surrounding her pregnancy, which had resulted from rape by her foster family's nephew. Her daughter Vivian, whom eugenicists claimed was also feeble-minded, proved to be an honor student before her early death from illness. The Supreme Court's endorsement of eugenic sterilization unleashed a wave of similar legislation across the country. An additional 18 states passed laws based on Laughlin's model, including Virginia in 1924. By 1930, 30 states had compulsory sterilization laws on their books, and the pace of sterilizations accelerated dramatically. More than 60,000 persons were sterilized before these laws were overturned. California led the nation in eugenic sterilizations, performing over 20,000 procedures by 1950. The state's program was particularly aggressive in targeting Mexican American and immigrant populations, with Spanish-speaking women often sterilized without their understanding or consent. Hospital administrators routinely sterilized women during childbirth or other medical procedures, falsifying consent forms or claiming that sterilization was medically necessary. The international impact of American sterilization laws was even more devastating. The Reichstag of Nazi Germany passed the law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring in 1933, closely based on Laughlin's model. German officials explicitly cited Buck vs. Bell and Laughlin's research as justification for their policies. Between 35,000 and 80,000 persons were sterilized in the first full year alone. It is now known that over 350,000 persons were sterilized. German implementation of eugenic sterilization was far more systematic and brutal than its American model. Nazi authorities expanded the categories of people subject to sterilization and eliminated many of the procedural safeguards that American laws maintained. The German program served as a testing ground for later Nazi policies of systematic murder, providing administrative experience and public conditioning for the Holocaust. Back at Cold Spring Harbor, Laughlin watched these developments with satisfaction, viewing them as validation of his scientific theories. Laughlin was awarded an honorary degree by the University of Heidelberg in 1936 for his work on behalf of the science of racial cleansing. He maintained correspondence with German eugenic researchers throughout the 1930s, exchanging research findings and policy recommendations, even as reports of Nazi brutality began reaching American newspapers. By 1925, cracks were beginning to appear in the scientific foundation of American eugenics, though the public and policymakers remained largely unaware of these problems. Many scholars criticized how data was obtained and further used to justify the claims from the Eugenics Record Office. Major criticism came from the Galton Laboratory. British researchers, ironically from the institution founded by eugenics pioneer Francis Galton, began publishing devastating critiques of American eugenic methodology. Critics mentioned data obtained by eugenicists lacked an approach free from bias. They also claimed the data did not match Mendelian genetics. For instance, one main critique was the labeling of heterozygotes. Heterozygotes were sometimes labeled intermediate, while other times heterozygotes were labeled normal. These inconsistencies revealed fundamental misunderstandings of basic genetics among researchers at Cold Spring Harbor. The most damaging criticism came from within American academic circles. Thomas Hunt Morgan, who had won the Nobel Prize for his work on fruit fly genetics, began questioning the ERO's research methods in professional journals. Morgan pointed out that complex human traits like intelligence and personality could not be reduced to simple Mendelian inheritance patterns, as Laughlin and Davenport claimed. The genetic basis for these traits was far too complicated to be traced through family trees collected by untrained field workers. A major critic of eugenics, A.M. Carr Saunders of Britain, mentioned eugenicists were incapable of providing a distinction between biological heredity and the environment. He claimed social factors were largely dismissed by eugenicists. This criticism struck at the heart of eugenic methodology, which consistently ignored the obvious environmental factors that influenced human development and behavior. Herbert Spencer Jennings, a respected geneticist who had initially supported the ERO, published increasingly sharp criticisms of eugenic research throughout the 1920s. Jennings demonstrated that the ERO's family studies failed to control for socioeconomic factors, educational opportunities, or social discrimination. When these environmental variables were taken into account, the apparent genetic patterns that eugenicists claimed to have discovered largely disappeared. The problems with ERO research became particularly apparent when independent researchers attempted to replicate eugenic studies. A 1928 investigation of the famous Kallikak family study, which purported to show hereditary mental deficiency across multiple generations, revealed that ERO field workers had fabricated evidence and misrepresented family histories. Photographs used in the original study had been altered to make family members appear mentally disabled, and court records showed that many supposedly feeble-minded individuals had actually been functioning members of their communities. Economist Joseph M. Gilman criticized the statistical analysis and research methodology of the ERO's work, arguing that there were rudimentary statistics errors. Professional statisticians demonstrated that the ERO's data analysis violated basic principles of scientific inference. using correlation to imply causation and selecting only evidence that supported predetermined conclusions while ignoring contradictory data. The international scientific community was also beginning to distance itself from American eugenics. The Second International Congress of Eugenics in 1921 had been dominated by American researchers, but by the Third Congress in 1932, many European scientists were presenting research that contradicted core eugenic assumptions. Studies of identical twins separated at birth showed that environment played a much larger role in human development than eugenicists had claimed. Perhaps most embarrassingly for the ERO, several of its own studies produced results that contradicted eugenic theory. A massive investigation of Ellis Island immigrants, conducted with ERO methods, found no significant differences in intelligence or genetic fitness between different ethnic groups. This finding was quietly suppressed and never published in eugenic literature, but it circulated among professional geneticists and further undermined the ERO's credibility. In the 1930s, the Carnegie Institution convened outside experts to evaluate the ERO. Its members agreed that the ERO research was unsatisfactory and futile. By that time, the ERO defined traits like self-respect and holding a grudge as measurable. The review committee's report was devastating, concluding that virtually none of the ERO's research met basic scientific standards and that its policy recommendations were based on prejudice rather than evidence. The committee found that ERO field workers had been instructed to look for evidence of genetic deficiency rather than conducting objective investigations. Training materials explicitly told workers to assume that poverty, crime, and mental illness were hereditary, and to construct family trees that supported these assumptions. When field workers found successful or accomplished individuals in supposedly defective families, they were instructed to list them as exceptions or to question the accuracy of family relationships. The committee recommended that the ERO stop mixing research with propaganda and politics. Laughlin rejected the committee's findings. Despite overwhelming evidence that his research was scientifically worthless, Laughlin refused to acknowledge any problems with ERO methodology. Instead, he claimed that his critics were motivated by political bias and lacked the courage to confront difficult truths about human heredity. The rise of Nazi Germany provided the final blow to eugenic credibility, yet his support of the race hygiene movement in Germany's Nazi Party was undeniable. The Nazi Party, which came to power in 1933, drew on American eugenic propaganda. Laughlin also wrote for German eugenics journals. As reports of Nazi brutality began reaching American newspapers, the public began to associate eugenics with totalitarianism and racial persecution. By 1935, even the Carnegie Institution could no longer ignore the scientific and moral problems with the ERO's work. In 1935, Carnegie sent a team to review the ERO's work, and as a result of their findings, ordered ERO to stop all work on their behalf. The institution that had funded eugenic research for 25 years was finally acknowledging what critics had been saying for over a decade. The ERO's research was scientifically worthless and socially dangerous. On September 15, 1935, the Nazi Party announced the Nuremberg Laws at their annual rally, systematically stripping Jews of their German citizenship and prohibiting marriages between Jews and non-Jewish Germans. What most Americans didn't realize was that these laws drew directly from American eugenic legislation, particularly the model sterilization laws crafted by Harry Laughlin at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. The connection was no secret to Nazi officials, who openly praised American eugenicists as pioneers in racial science. The connections between the ERO and the Nazi racial hygiene movement were extensive and well known. The ERO's newsletter, Eugenical News, was one of the principal conduits through which German racial ideas reached an American audience in the 1920s and 1930s. The publication regularly featured positive reviews of German research on racial hygiene, reprinted articles by Nazi scientists, and promoted books advocating for racial purity and genetic improvement. The correspondence files at Cold Spring Harbor reveal the depth of collaboration between American and German eugenicists throughout the 1920s and 1930s. During the height of the regime, high-ranking Nazi officials corresponded with the ERO, sending postage marked with swastikas across the Atlantic to Cold Spring Harbor. These letters weren't hidden or secretive. They were part of open scientific exchange that continued even as reports of Nazi persecution reached American newspapers. Psychiatrist Carl Schneider was a lead researcher of Action T4, a Nazi program that murdered more than 70,000 children and adults perceived as physically or intellectually disabled. Schneider praised the ERO as important pioneers in the field of racial hygiene. This praise came from a man who was simultaneously organizing the systematic murder of disabled individuals in German institutions, demonstrating the deadly trajectory of eugenic thinking when taken to its logical conclusion. The intellectual exchange worked in both directions. Influence moved in the other direction as well. German eugenicists in the early 1900s paid close attention to American eugenics legislation, and leading eugenicists from both sides of the Atlantic held conferences and supported the exchange of information and scholarly materials. German researchers regularly visited Cold Spring Harbor to study American methods, while Laughlin and other ERO staff contributed articles to German eugenic journals. Biologist Ottmar Freiherr von Verschuer was the parallel to Charles Davenport here in America. Torres says, Verschuer encouraged his student, SS physician, Josef Mengele, to apply for his eventual role at Auschwitz concentration camp, where he would perform gruesome experiments on children and adults. This direct connection between Cold Spring Harbor's methods and Mengele's atrocities reveals how American eugenic research provided intellectual justification for Nazi brutality. The relationship between American eugenicists and Nazi researchers wasn't merely academic. The Rockefeller Foundation, one of the primary funders of American eugenic research, also provided financial support to German racial hygiene programs. The Rockefeller Foundation helped found the German eugenics program, and even funded the program that Josef Mengele worked in before he went to Auschwitz. This funding continued into the mid-1930s, well after the Nazi regime's violent intentions had become clear. Laughlin was awarded an honorary degree by the University of Heidelberg in 1936 for his work on behalf of the science of racial cleansing. The ceremony was held just 3 years after Germany had implemented sterilization laws based directly on Laughlin's model. The honorary degree citation explicitly praised Laughlin's contributions to racial hygiene and genetic improvement, terms that had taken on sinister meanings in Nazi Germany. American eugenic organizations were slower to recognize the implications of Nazi policies than individual scientists. The American Eugenics Society continued to promote positive relations with German researchers throughout the 1930s, even as reports of sterilization programs and racial persecution became widely known. Society publications regularly featured articles by German scientists and praised Nazi legislation as progressive social policy. The full extent of American eugenic influence on Nazi policy became clear only after World War II, when captured German documents revealed the systematic study of American eugenic laws. After the war, eugenics was declared a crime against humanity, an act of genocide. Germans were tried and they cited the California statutes in their defense. To no avail. They were found guilty. Nazi defendants at war crimes trials explicitly cited American precedents, particularly Buck vs. Bell and Laughlin's model sterilization law, as justification for their actions. The American eugenic establishment's response to Nazi brutality was complex and revealing. Some researchers, particularly those with Jewish backgrounds or liberal political views, quickly distanced themselves from German racial hygiene when its violent implications became clear. But many core eugenicists, including Laughlin, continued to defend Nazi policies even after reports of concentration camps and systematic murder reached American shores. Typical was an exchange July 25, 1946, when Popenoe wrote Verschuer, "It was indeed a pleasure to hear from you again." This correspondence, written after the full extent of Nazi atrocities had been revealed at the Nuremberg trials, showed that some American eugenicists maintained their professional relationships with German colleagues, despite knowing about their participation in genocide. The revelation of Nazi connections devastated public support for American eugenics almost overnight. Shortly after, it came to light that American eugenic research inspired the Nazis. The rising tide of eugenics research in the U.S. quickly dissipated, at least publicly. Organizations that had proudly promoted eugenic research for decades suddenly distanced themselves from the movement, claiming they had never supported racial persecution or forced sterilization. but the damage had already been done. American eugenic research had provided the intellectual framework and practical methods for systematic human rights violations on an unprecedented scale. The scientists at Cold Spring Harbor had created not just flawed research, but a blueprint for genocide. The autumn of our 1935 brought an ominous silence to the halls of Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory as a committee of distinguished scientists convened to conduct what would become the most damaging evaluation in the institution's history. In 1935, Carnegie sent a team to review the ERO's work, and as a result of their findings, ordered ERO to stop all work on their behalf. The review had been initiated not by external critics, but by Carnegie Institution administrators who had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the ERO's radical positions and declining scientific reputation. The committee's findings were devastating and unambiguous. Eventually, in 1939, they withdrew their support completely when an outside visiting committee reported that the research carried out at the ERO was worthless from a genetic point of view. 25 years of research, hundreds of thousands of family records, and millions of dollars in funding had produced nothing of scientific value. Everything the ERO had published was based on flawed methodology, biased data collection, and predetermined conclusions. The committee examined the ERO's research methods in excruciating detail, finding fundamental errors at every level of the organization's work. Field workers had been systematically biased in their data collection, trained to look for evidence of genetic deficiency rather than conducting objective investigations. The statistical analysis was riddled with elementary errors that would have embarrassed a first-year graduate student. Most damning of all, the research showed clear evidence of deliberate manipulation, with data being altered or suppressed when it contradicted eugenic theories. Harry Laughlin's response to the committee's findings revealed the depth of his delusion and the dangerous rigidity of his beliefs. Laughlin rejected the committee's findings entirely, claiming that the committee members were motivated by political correctness and lacked the courage to confront difficult truths about human heredity. He argued that critics were being influenced by Jewish intellectualism and communist propaganda, revealing the anti-Semitic and paranoid thinking that had always lurked beneath his scientific facade. But Laughlin's defiance could no longer protect the ERO from mounting external pressures. Reports of Nazi atrocities were increasingly common in American newspapers, and the connection between American eugenics and German racial hygiene was becoming impossible to ignore. However, reports about the extensive use of compulsory sterilization in Germany began to appear in U.S. newspapers. By the end of the decade, eugenics had become associated with Nazism and poor science. The scientific community's rejection of eugenics accelerated rapidly after 1935. Professional journals stopped publishing eugenic research, academic conferences eliminated eugenic sessions, and prominent scientists publicly distanced themselves from the movement. By the 1930s, many prominent scientists were openly critical of the scientific merits of eugenics. Among them were some who had previously been supportive, including geneticist Thomas Hunt Morgan and statistician Raymond Pearl. Financial support for eugenic research evaporated with similar speed. The Rockefeller Foundation quietly terminated its funding for human heredity research, redirecting its resources toward legitimate medical genetics. State governments stopped requesting ERO advice on sterilization policies, and several states began reviewing their eugenic laws in light of new scientific evidence. Even the American Eugenics Society saw its membership decline precipitously, as educated Americans began to understand the movement's scientific bankruptcy. The final blow came in 1939 with the appointment of Vannevar Bush as president of the Carnegie Institution. In 1939, the Carnegie Institution's new president, Vannevar Bush, forced Laughlin's retirement and withdrew funding for the ERO entirely, forcing its closure by the end of that year. Bush, who would later direct American scientific research during World War II, understood that continued association with eugenics would damage the institution's reputation and credibility. The Eugenics Record Office closed in 1939, ending nearly 3 decades of pseudoscientific research that had influenced legislation in dozens of states and inspired genocidal policies in Nazi Germany. The closure was announced quietly, with minimal public attention. Former ERO staff were reassigned to other research projects or encouraged to find positions elsewhere. The massive collection of family records was distributed among various institutions, though much of the material was eventually recognized as scientifically worthless. Charles Davenport's response to the ERO's closure revealed his complete inability to understand the magnitude of his scientific and moral failure. Even in retirement, he continued to defend eugenic principles and maintained that his critics were motivated by political bias rather than scientific evidence. Although many other scientists had stopped supporting eugenics due to the rise of Nazism in Germany, Charles Davenport remained a fervent supporter until the end of his life. The physical transformation of Cold Spring Harbor in the late 1930s reflected the institution's desperate attempt to distance itself from its eugenic past. Laughlin was let go and the ERO closed in 1939, and the laboratory quickly rebranded itself as a center for legitimate genetic research. The ERO building was converted to other uses, and references to eugenic research were removed from official publications and promotional materials. But the damage to human rights and scientific integrity could not be so easily erased. Over 35 states passed and used eugenic sterilization laws, and by the 1960s, when these laws were beginning to be repealed, more than 60,000 people who had been judged genetically defective had been forcibly sterilized without consent. The international influence of American eugenics had been even more catastrophic, providing the intellectual foundation for Nazi racial policies that would culminate in the Holocaust. The scientific community's complicity in this disaster raised profound questions about the relationship between research and social responsibility that continue to resonate today. Today, the Georgian colonial mansion that once housed the Eugenics Record Office sits quietly on a tree-lined street in Laurel Hollow, New York, its dark history hidden behind well-manicured lawns and expensive renovations. The Georgian colonial-style building still exists today at 1682 Laurel Hollow Road, having been sold off as a private residence. It was last sold for $175 million in 2015. Few of the wealthy Long Island residents who drive past this house daily realize they are passing the birthplace of one of the most destructive scientific movements in human history. The Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory itself has undergone a complete transformation since the closure of the ERO in 1939. The Carnegie Institution's Department of Genetics formally merged with the Biological Laboratory in 1962, taking on the new name Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. The institution has since become renowned for legitimate genetic research, hosting Nobel Prize winners and making genuine contributions to medical science. But this redemption came only after a thorough reckoning with its eugenic past. The legal legacy of American eugenics proved remarkably persistent, outlasting the scientific credibility that had supposedly justified it. A law allowing for the sterilization of repeat criminals was overturned in 1942 in Skinner versus Oklahoma, but sterilizations of mental patients continued into the 1970s. Some U.S. sterilization laws remained in place until the 1980s, with the last forced sterilizations occurring decades after the scientific community had unanimously rejected eugenic theories. The human cost of the eugenic movement defies easy calculation. In the United States alone, more than 60,000 people were forcibly sterilized under laws inspired by Cold Spring Harbor research. These victims included individuals with mental disabilities, epileptics, criminals, and those whose only defect was poverty or social nonconformity. The sterilizations disproportionately targeted women, racial minorities, and immigrants, revealing the movement's true agenda of social control rather than genetic improvement. Internationally, the impact was even more catastrophic. American eugenicists' work had worldwide ramifications. In Germany, the National Socialists used Laughlin's model as one of the bases of their sweeping sterilization law of 1933, which ultimately led to the sterilization of over 400,000 people. The German sterilization program served as a testing ground for the administrative methods and public conditioning that would make the Holocaust possible. The connection between American eugenics and Nazi genocide was not merely inspirational, but directly practical. One of the largest misconceptions was that Nazi Germany kind of led this to the U.S. It's completely opposite, says Torres, whose book describes how the ideas conceived on Long Island-inspired eugenic experiments later committed by the Nazis during the Holocaust. The systematic study of American laws, the exchange of personnel and ideas, and the explicit citation of American precedents in Nazi legislation demonstrated the global reach of ideas that originated in the quiet laboratories of Cold Spring Harbor. The scientific community's response to this history has been mixed, ranging from genuine soul-searching to defensive denial. Many institutions that participated in eugenic research have issued formal apologies and established programs to study the ethical implications of their past work. Others have simply tried to forget, removing references to eugenic research from their official histories and hoping that time will obscure their complicity. Today, Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory maintains the full historical records, communications, and artifacts of the ERO for historical, teaching, and research purposes. The institution has become a leader in promoting ethical genetics research and educating scientists about the dangers of allowing prejudice to masquerade as objective science. The laboratory's archives serve as a sobering reminder of how easily scientific authority can be abused when researchers abandon their commitment to truth in favor of social advocacy. The eugenic episode raises profound questions about the nature of scientific objectivity and the responsibility of researchers to society. The scientists at Cold Spring Harbor genuinely believed they were conducting legitimate research and contributing to human welfare. Their credentials were impeccable, their methods appeared scientific, and their conclusions were published in respected journals. Yet their work was fundamentally corrupted by prejudice, methodological bias, and predetermined conclusions. Modern genetics has completely discredited the scientific assumptions underlying eugenics. We now understand that human traits like intelligence and personality are influenced by thousands of genes interacting with complex environmental factors in ways that cannot be predicted or controlled through breeding programs. The genetic diversity that eugenicists sought to eliminate is actually essential for human health and adaptation. Most importantly, we recognize that human worth cannot be measured by genetic characteristics, and that reproductive autonomy is a fundamental human right. But the eugenic legacy continues to cast shadows over contemporary debates about genetics, intelligence, and social policy. The relevance of this book is timely and incredibly important as topics of racism, classism, the dangers of political rhetoric, popular culture sensationalism, reproductive rights, and access to healthcare for the diseased and disabled are reminiscent of the eugenics period, said Professor Torres. The story of Cold Spring Harbor serves as a permanent warning about the dangers of scientific arrogance and the ease with which research can be corrupted by social prejudice. In the quiet halls where eugenicists once planned the genetic improvement of humanity, we must remember the victims of their ambitions and commit ourselves to ensuring that science serves human dignity rather than undermining it. The mansion may have become a private residence, but its history belongs to all humanity, as a reminder of how easily good intentions can lead to unspeakable evil.